Welcome to the fifth annual Food Justice Film Festival presented by the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm Linda Rico, Food Justice Film Festival organizer with the center. Today, I'm joined by Jamie Berger, the executive producer of The Smell of Money, an award-winning documentary that follows the story of Elsie Herring and her rural North Carolina community as they team up to fight generations of environmental, social, and racial injustice by the world's largest pork company. It's also one of the films we're featuring this year at the Food Justice Film Festival. Jamie has used her talent in writing and storytelling to bring important issues to light, from environmental racism and the climate crises to other injustices against people, animals, and the planet. Welcome and thank you so much for joining me, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you again for featuring our film.
Of course. It's an amazing film, and I'm so excited for our viewers to watch it.
Thank
So,
you.
of course. So I wanted to jump in and ask, how did you first get involved in this film and Elsie Herring's story?
So I grew up in North Carolina. I was born and raised outside of Raleigh, which is not in the eastern part of the state, which is, primarily where the film takes place, but only about 30, 40 miles down the road from that area. And, like most people in North Carolina, I grew up eating barbecue and bacon and not thinking much about where those products actually came from. And then I started to learn more about the environment in high school and kind of ended up wanting to devote my college studies to looking at how the food system impacts the environment and also, people and animals and our health. So I did that, and I ended up focusing my senior honors thesis as an undergrad on the North Carolina pork industry, which seemed kind of like a natural fit looking at, the food system in my home state, pork being such a big industry. And that was when I first kind of started to learn about the issues that we feature in the film. I learned about the major water pollution problems, water and air pollution. I looked at also the history of labor rights organizing in the pork industry in North Carolina, and just the kind of the industry's growth. It really had exploded in the state just over the course of my lifetime,
Mhm.
and its influence on the government. That was kind of a big, part of it too, is looking at how it had influenced policy and how it had sort of paved the way for its own growth by
Right.
being so tied to the government in North Carolina.
Mhm.
And one of the pieces that really hit me personally and kind of hit me hard was learning about the issue that we feature in the film primarily, which is this issue of environmental injustice. The fact that these massive CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, animal factories essentially, are disproportionately located in communities of color and in communities with high rates of poverty.
Right.
So that to me just felt like such a grave injustice that, again, was happening not that far down the road from where I grew up. And I was really shocked by it and shocked that I hadn't heard about that and that most people I knew had not heard about that. And that experience of kind of doing that in-depth research on this issue led me to become an activist. It was really kind of at that time that I learned about specifically the pork industry and its harms to people and the environment and animals in North Carolina that I said, this is what I want to devote the rest of my life to solving this problem.
Right.
um,
Yeah. That's
yeah,
amazing.
and I had heard about Elsie's story at that point too. And I was so inspired by her right away, really just taken by her bravery, her resilience, her ability to stand up to this massive, just enormous industry. So later, I was working as an activist, as a video producer, and had the chance to work on a feature film with my co-producer. And we were tossing around subjects, tossing around topic ideas, and this is the one that I felt most called to, and was really excited, to go back and reconnect with a lot of the people that I had interviewed and whose stories I had heard back when I was a college student. So
That's
that's how it
incredible.
got started.
I love hearing that story. And I love that you brought up, that huge injustice of where these pork farms were specifically choosing to locate. And you see that in the film where they they show the map, I believe, of the red line neighborhoods, the historically red line neighborhoods, and then the map over it of the pork farms, and it's just shocking, like you said.
Yeah,
It's an incredible film, and the amount of research that went into it is just it's amazing, and I love it. I haven't
thank
been able
you.
to stop telling people about it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Of course. So there are about 10 million pigs living across North Carolina, and in Elsie's County, which is Duplin County, North Carolina, pigs outnumber people almost 40 to 1. So with that many pigs, I can only imagine what the smell was like. And I wanted to know, what was your experience with that, and what kind of protections did you need to take, physical, um, mental, any kind of protections you needed to take while filming.
Yeah, I wish the smell was something that we could convey through film because that really is such a big part of the experience for people and such a big part of the injustice for people in that part of North Carolina. I think for us, we had the privilege of being able to leave, at the end of the day. Often we weren't staying right in the kind of worst, the most stinky areas.
Uh-huh.
We had the ability to go back to a hotel or something. And that was something that I always kept in mind.
Mhm.
Um, but even for the times that we were there, we spent, of course, a lot of time, filmed for about 4.5 years in Eastern North Carolina.
Mhm.
We were definitely really affected by it, and it is hard to describe because it's just so overpowering. It really just kind of takes, it just sort of takes over you when you get it coming through the wind, especially. And something I think that really stood out to me was how potent it was even after we left.
Oh, wow.
So I would have to wash my clothes several times. It would kind of stick in my hair. I would
Mhm.
smell it even after I took a shower, kind of
Wow.
still sort of embedded in my body.
Mhm.
Um, and that was just from spending, sometimes that was just from spending a couple hours, in a place where we could smell it really strongly. So you can imagine, of course, what it's like to live somewhere where that smell is nearly constant and coming in through your windows. Every time you walk outside, you just kind of get hit in the face with it.
Yeah.
It smells, very definitely very fecal because that
Mhm.
is a big part of what it is the
Right.
smell of feces and urine.
Okay.
But there's also this other kind of weird sort of chemical like smell to
Mhm.
it. It's not just like stepping into, you know, a barn that you
Right.
would picture. Like old McDonald's farm has a little kind of
Yeah.
maybe kind of hay and poop smell, but this
Right.
is nothing like that.
Like
It
more
smells very kind of
toxic.
industrial.
Right.
And it's the worst. It's horrible. It's really just terrible.
Yeah, I spoke with Sean, the director, and he had mentioned that he had like terrible migraines from
That's
being out
right.
there. And I wanted
Yeah.
to know, like, did you have anything like that? Like any sort of like ailments that came up that you had to deal with?
Fortunately, I didn't have anything like that. I think I, to be honest, suffered more kind of mentally and emotionally
Mhm.
spending time in that part of the state. I think um as amazing as it was to be able to spend so much time with the people, and we fell in love with so many of them.
Yeah.
um there are just so many different kind of elements of this industry and the way that it exploits people, and of course the environment and animals, that were very emotionally challenging to deal with. And we also, I don't want to give anything away, any spoilers for the film,
Mhm.
but definitely experienced, seeing people we had grown to love become really affected,
Right.
have their health really impacted. And I think that was definitely the hardest part for me. It was not so much the physical aspect of it.
Right. So you brought up, just seeing this harm happening to the community and then also to the animals. And, with what's happening right now in North Carolina, the devastation from Hurricane Helene is just absolutely heartbreaking to say the least. But it's really put the spotlight back on human-caused climate change. And, in the news right now, Smithfield has been very vocal about, and they're also one of the largest pork processors, has said that, some of their transportation was strained, but, they haven't suffered any, I think they said material disruptions. But we do know in the past that hog farms in North Carolina have flooded over before. And more specifically, their hog lagoons, which are full of toxic hog waste, have flooded over. And we know this over the years. And I wanted to get your insight on that. Even though they say it didn't happen this time, what kinds of health dangers would something like that pose to people in the community?
Yeah, I mean, it really is truly um so sad to see the devastation that's happening in mostly in Western North Carolina. And I know that parts of Eastern North Carolina, where most of the CAFOs are concentrated, has experienced some flooding, some damage for sure. And I am often skeptical when the industry says that they haven't been affected by it. I think they've gotten better over the years at kind of concealing the damage that the wreckage that they cause when hurricanes come through,
Mhm.
because they have gotten so much negative publicity from that. In in our experience, while we were filming, a massive record-breaking Hurricane Florence, came through Eastern North Carolina, and it's hard to even describe just how horrific the scene was following that. We had people who we had spent a lot of time with filming whose houses were completely destroyed. They had been completely flooded with
Mhm.
basically animal manure. What happens in the case of hurricanes or even just like heavy rains, flooding, this can happen. The open pits where the waste is stored, where waste from these massive pig operations is stored, overflow or breach. Often they will break, the walls will break, and the entire contents of that, which is again feces, urine, also kind of industrial cleaners, blood, antibiotics, all of that spills right into the open floodwaters and runs, into the street, runs into people's yards. We had a bunch of people, tell us, yeah, my house got flooded and smelled like poop
Wow.
because that was really what was in that water.
Mhm.
Um, it's just the wreckage that causes is so staggering, and it's obviously hugely detrimental to human health and of course to the environment. We've seen in North Carolina massive fish kills when a single lagoon has ruptured. Can you imagine what happens to wildlife when an entire kind of region of these big open pits is just spilled into the water, into the floodwater? So for people, this can mean exposure to really kind of very high dangerous levels of bacteria in the water, other kinds of pathogens, viruses that they might not otherwise be exposed to.
Mhm.
And just the kind of, again, the stench and the filth and the kind of lasting, I think, impact of having just that much waste inundate your community. There are, I'm sure, we know there are health impacts that last long beyond the time that the floodwaters recede.
Right. Since the 1950s, the US meat and dairy production has more than doubled, from the practice of concentrated animal confinement on factory farms to the massive land use required to produce feed crops for livestock and pollution generated by poorly regulated waste management in slaughterhouses. The current US food system is unstable and a leading contributor to environmental degradation. While you were filming, can you describe the landscape for our viewers? Like, was there a lot of polluted water that you saw? Was there a lot of polluted soil? Had you seen this before in previous work that you had done, or even when you were researching in college?
Yeah, I think it was really eye-opening, really enlightening, to actually see firsthand kind of what I had learned about in a more academic context.
Mhm.
There are, I think, North Carolina the case of environmental injustice, the case of kind of CAFO pollution has been studied so heavily in North Carolina. There's a long kind of legacy of research that's been done, and fortunately community-based research, which I think is amazing that people had been involved in determining, what studies looked like. And there are so many, various documented impacts on the environment. And it feels very different, to read about those kinds of things and then to be able to actually see them. And for sure, I mean, we saw water that was visibly polluted. You could see that just by looking at it, that there was no life in it.
Right.
You could tell that no creature could survive in water like that. It was just so, choked with algae and with this kind of like foamy film that was kind of really common to see. And, fortunately, we had the guidance of a Waterkeeper Alliance and their kind of regional chapters, the river keepers and water keepers in Eastern North Carolina, who are responsible for, protecting the waters. And they have been amazing kind of pioneers in terms of challenging the industry and trying to hold it accountable for this kind of pollution. And they were able to kind of take us around and actually do water sampling with us and show us how that works. And I really, there was one kind of experience that stands out to me where we were, in the field and we could just see that the water was, I mean, just disgusting, kind of in a ditch that was in an area that was just completely surrounded by CAFOs. And when they sampled that, they found that literally the levels of bacteria in that water, fecal bacteria like E. coli, were so high that they were literally off the charts. There was no way to even measure. The measuring devices that the lab that they send the samples off to, this very kind of official lab, could not even measure how high the bacteria levels were. So, that was it really is, like I said, very very eye-opening to actually be able to see that, and to see, also just the kind of, I don't know if I can even call this pollution, but the sort of just death that pervades that area. We would see what the industry calls dead trucks, which are just trucks full of animal carcasses going down the road and spilling out their contents. We would drive behind them to film and get kind of this like, waft of this horrific smell. And, there would be times where we would find ourselves in places just surrounded by hundreds or thousands of vultures, birds of prey who had been drawn to that area because, or sorry, I guess not birds of prey, but, scavengers who had been drawn to that area because of the stench of death and of rotting animals. And you don't think of that necessarily when you think of pollution, but for, I think, people in this part of North Carolina, the part of the pollution is just being surrounded by the smell of death, the smell of feces and urine, and the visual kind of pollution of seeing that kind of, basically dumpsters overflowing with dead animals, those kinds of things. So there were a lot of really gruesome things that we saw, for sure. Yeah.
You actually brought up something in my next question. So we know that the meat and dairy industries are not only major contributors of climate change, but these industries are also known for housing animals, obviously in extremely inhumane conditions, resulting in animal sickness, death, like you mentioned, unclean work environments, and facilitating the spread of diseases and viruses. Can you describe how these pigs are housed in these CAFOs and on these farms so that our viewers can get a better idea of like what we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically the way that these operations are laid out, they will have a number of, sometimes 8 to 10 or more, basically long metal sheds, and then adjoining those is the lagoons, or the industry calls them lagoons, we call them open pits, cesspits, basically, where the waste from these facilities is pumped. But inside of them, animals are crammed by the thousands. In the case of poultry, in the case of chickens and turkeys, it can be tens of thousands. crammed into very, very confined spaces. Often, for pigs, mother pigs are kept in what's called gestation crates, which are crates that are barely larger than their bodies, in which they can barely turn around or lie down comfortably. And they spend nearly, their entire lives in those kinds of cages. And even when they're in kind of slightly larger pens, they're still held, in a way that is so counter to the natural behaviors that they would otherwise express if they were, outside, exposed to sunlight and grass. And pigs are really, pigs are so curious, so intelligent. They're smarter than dogs. We even had farmers talk to us about how smart and sociable and just curious and interested in you, they are. There's this line in the film that I actually love because a farmer himself said, if you spend just a few minutes with one of the pigs in here, you can come back the next day and that pig will remember you, will walk up to you. They're so playful and inquisitive, and they're kept in conditions that, we would never subject a dog or a cat to. We would never think that that's okay. Of course, we wouldn't want to live in this kind of place ourselves, concrete floors covered in their own waste, and often, not provided individual veterinary care because there are just so many of them. Speaking with farmers, interacting with them, it's pretty clear that their kind of main job is basically to go through and euthanize dying animals and remove ones who have died, which is also not a job that anyone would really choose to do necessarily. So it's just a grim situation, for the animals and for people, like you said, who work in that kind of environment, who are exposed to the diseases that run rampant because the animals are so, they're so immunocompromised in that kind of environment and exposed to just such high levels of pathogens. So all around, it's a pretty nightmarish kind of place.
Yeah. And it goes into my next question, that, aside from obviously the terrible animal abuse, that nobody likes that, no one wants to hear about that. There's also, of course, serious and fatal accidents that happen in slaughterhouses on the animal production line, with workers who are usually migrant or immigrant workers. A lot of worker abuse that has been known to happen. And I wanted to kind of bring light to that as well. Like, if you could just talk a bit about like why places like factory farms, like why have they become so unsafe?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think kind of the simple answer to it is that the companies who control our food system see people and animals, and particularly, like you said, migrants, people of color, as disposable, as expendable, as just widgets in their machine to be used and cast aside. And we saw this firsthand. We weren't able to include much about, the slaughter plants themselves in our film, but I hope someday to be able to focus on a project related to that. But we were able to talk to a lot of people and get a lot of footage, related to that issue. And we spoke with workers who described the just really severe injuries that happen, the kind of violence that happens within plants, interpersonal violence. I think because people are so stressed and experiencing the trauma of having to kill all day and having to, use kind of very sharp, dangerous knives and other equipment. They're exposed to chemicals that can burn them, that can cause all kinds of really, really serious, health impacts from just the exposure. We talked to one woman who told us that she had witnessed people become ill, become sick, and throw up during their shift, and would actually land on the animals, and they would wash it off and put the chickens back on the slaughter line. Like, just again, kind of really revolting stories.
Right.
And just, I think we heard from her just about just kind of the drudgery, the tedium of having to work so fast, work shoulder to shoulder with other people on lines that are moving, hundreds of birds a minute, in the case of poultry. And yeah, I think really, like like I said, that I think the answer to the question of why does this happen is that I think, there's just an acceptability both in society and within this industry in particular of sacrificing poor people, people of color, migrants, women. Women experience higher levels of sexual harassment in this industry than they do in other kinds of even manufacturing. I think it's just a matter of this industry being okay with treating people as less than, as fundamentally less than, and seeing them as valueless. And that goes back to capitalism and deeply embedded racism in our society, and classism. And I think that a slaughter plant shows all of those kinds of horrible forms of oppression on full display.
What do you think is, some of the easiest things that people can do to at least make some sort of difference? Is it changing their diet? Is it donating? Like, how can people easily take action?
There are so many different ways I think we can all take action. And sometimes I'm asked, what's the one big thing? And I think there isn't one big thing. And I think everyone kind of has to find their place in challenging this system. I think just starting at an individual level, certainly, refusing to support an industry like this by changing what we eat is a great first step. And I think it's important to remember that 99% of the animal products produced in the United States come from these kinds of facilities that we've been talking about, come from these concentrated animal feeding operations. So I think a lot of people still have in mind, oh, well, I'll just look for, the humane label or the free range label. And most of those are just marketing claims. They're pretty deceptive. So I would say, if you can cut back on the amount of meat and dairy and eggs that you eat, it's not about necessarily going vegan overnight. It's I think it's about finding what works for you and taking those steps. And I think really the benefit of that is not just for you kind of stepping away from the system, but I think that can have kind of a ripple effect on other people as well, and the people around you might be inspired to follow suit. I think also it's important that we don't just stop with individual action, that we think about what are the kind of other connections to power that I have, whether that's maybe a university that you are affiliated with, either as a student or a professor. Is it a school? Is it a community organization that you're a part of? Is your workplace potentially contributing to this in some way? And kind of think about, for example, with college students, I often tell them, if you can just start to shift the purchasing power of your college, that's a whole lot more than just you deciding not to buy a product.
Yeah.
I also think it's really important for us to get politically engaged, to look at, where our elected officials are voting on these kinds of issues and put our efforts behind the people who are trying to change this system.
Right.
They really need our support because they're up against a Goliath in the meat industry. And I would also say, I think it's so important that we support local kind of grassroots based, especially people of color led organizations that are really on the front lines of experiencing the harms of this kind of industry, from this industry. And I think who have the greatest kind of knowledge about how to address those, because they are so directly impacted and because they have the people power. They're the ones who can really mobilize people on the ground and support them in their fight against this. And I think it's important for those of us who maybe aren't directly impacted to still remember that we can engage with those kinds of groups, that we can become part of their movement as well.
Exactly. What do you think is the most important thing that you learned through making this film?
I think probably the learning that stood out to me the most was about persistence. Um, Elsie Herring, the kind of central character of our film, spent the better part of 30 years or so in this fight. And she, I think, of course, like anyone would, experienced moments of, feeling defeated, feeling really kind of overwhelmed,
Right.
feeling like it was going nowhere.
Yeah.
Um, but she just kept going. And I think for me as a kind of, starting, at least when I started this film, I was a kind of newer, younger activist. Seeing someone who had been in it for so long just, I think, gave me a sense of perspective that this is not going to be solved overnight.
Right.
Cat interference, I apologize.
It's okay.
This is not going to be solved overnight. And it might even take more than a single person's lifetime. It might even take more than our own lifetimes.
Mhm.
Um, I think that was both like discouraging to me and really scary and sad in some ways.
Yeah.
But also I think a really good reminder that we have to just continue building. We have to just continue kind of working at this, pulling it apart, one thread at a time. And I think really rely on the other people around us who care about these same issues, who are in the fight alongside us to support us through that, because I just don't think we can do it without a really strong community.
Yeah.
That was another thing I feel like I really learned from Elsie. And you know, like she says in the film, the fight continues. And I think that's just like the simplest way of putting it. Like no matter what, the fight just continues. And she saw that in such plain terms. And I think that really stuck with me too.
Mhm. So I wanted to give you some space now to talk about any other projects you're working on and if there's any way we can support or what to look out for.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about other projects, new projects. I'm in the kind of early stages of exploring a partnership with one amazing woman named Allison Argo, who's a filmmaker who has had films on National Geographic and PBS and has done incredible kind of animal focused films for, I think, most of her career. And she recently, right now, she's kind of putting the finishing touches on a film about a refuge, an farmed animal refuge called Piedmont Farm Animal Refuge. And it's in eastern North, or sorry, it's not in eastern North Carolina. I say eastern all the time. It's in more central North Carolina. But it's an amazing, beautiful, beautiful place, where animals are treated as individuals. And I think one of the unique things about the refuge is that they really design the kind of buildings and structures um, there for the animals, really kind of with them and their needs in mind. And that's kind of what the film is about. So yeah, I'm exploring potentially working with her to help her kind of with distribution and the impact campaign associated with that. And I'm really excited about it. I think it feels like it'll be kind of a healing project because it's really positive. It's really just kind of it's a film I think literally anyone could sit down and watch and enjoy and feel good about. And I think it just kind of builds compassion and kind of moves away from sort of the negative problems, the hard things about this work and this industry, and just shows what a different world I think could be like for animals and for us. Yeah.
That's so amazing. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
I'm excited.
I'm looking forward to seeing more about that, and we'll make sure to, if you want to, send any websites or anything, or
For sure.
we'll make sure to share that.
That'd be great. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
I don't think so. I'm just so grateful to you and to the festival and the amazing work that you all do. I think
Thank you.
it's really needed. I think it's really important that we kind of come together and have opportunities to sort of look at the different ways that we're telling stories about these kinds of issues and how we're kind of bringing those stories into our advocacy. And so I really kind of appreciate the focus on both, the art itself and the change that it can bring. And yeah, just very inspired and really grateful to be a small part of it.
Oh, thank you. We're so happy to have you be a part of it. And as a reminder to everyone watching, don't forget to sign up for this year's Food Justice Film Festival at foodjusticefilmfestival.com. As always, the festival is totally free to sign up and totally free to watch. And you can watch all 4 feature films anytime from October 24th through the 27th. You can also catch all of our 2024 virtual interviews on the site all year long. Thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day. And thank you so much, Jamie, for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks so much.